Your labor is not in vain. Though the ground underneath you is cursed and stained, your planting and reaping are never the same. But your labor is not in vain.
Isaac Wardell. You've probably never heard of him, but as the worship minister at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlottesville, Virginia, he understands very well the need for unity in a racially and politically divided church and country. The violent Unite the Right white supremacist rally garnering international attention happened just very close to his church and hit home for Wardell and his entire congregation. I had the opportunity to sit down with him recently to talk about his brand new album From the Porter's Gate, which is a new conversation, a new community around racial unity and just about what it means to really follow Christ. And the first fruits of The Porter's Gate is a new worship album called Work Songs, and it features Audrey Assad, Josh Garrels, Liz Weiss, Urban Doxology, and Aaron Keyes. It's earthy, sober, raw, and organic, as you'll be hearing, as I get to pepper the songs throughout this podcast and in and among the conversation that Isaac Wardell and I had just a few weeks ago. I just think you're going to really enjoy the authenticity, the desire for unity and racial reconciliation and authentic discipleship that is Isaac Wardell.
The vineyards you plant will bear fruit. I am with you. I am with you. I am with you. I am with you. For I've called you by name.
Hey everybody, John Chisholm here. Thanks for joining us today on the Song Revolution podcast. And as usual, we are always out seeking interesting, amazing people, artists, industry people, songwriters, and today is just no exception. I have somebody that I think you're going to really, really enjoy. I know you're going to love the music. I know that you're going to just love what this guy is all about. And as you heard in the intro, we have Isaac Wardell from the Porter's Gate, who are doing so many interesting things, a sacred arts collective, series of songs and albums that are intended to be true services to the body of Christ. So without further ado, welcome, Isaac.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Man, I'm so glad to meet you. I've previewed this album, and I know that there's so much more to talk about than this album, but dude, I'm in love with this music. It's really awesome.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So you are a Presbyterian minister.
Yeah. So I work as the worship director at a Presbyterian church in Charlottesville, Virginia. I've been here about 9 years. Before that, I was in Tennessee and New York City for a little while.
Wow, that's kind of diverse, isn't it?
Yeah, a couple different places. I mean, as you and I were discussing before we began taping today, we're both originally from Memphis, Tennessee, sort of sometimes called the buckle of the Bible Belt. And I grew up, being in high school in the 90s, really getting into worship music and leading worship in the context of my sort of evangelical megachurch back in high school. So in many ways, I'm very grateful to have grown up in Memphis, which is a place where there's lots of great music, really formative experience for me. And that was kind of what kickstarted me into this sort of vocational path as being a worship director for my job.
Yeah, so like you play guitar, keys, sing.
Yeah, I play guitar and some piano. I mean, most of what I do is really arranging. I studied arranging in college, and a lot of what I've done outside of leading worship has been producing and arranging other people's music. So the arranging and producing side is the part I really enjoy.
We've been gone from Memphis a long time, but it sure is a music city, kind of like Nashville in a lot of ways.
Absolutely is. And, in some ways, just to get right into it, I think growing up in Memphis not only had a lot to do with my kind of career trajectory, but in many ways, a lot to do with sort of a spiritual trajectory that I found myself on, where one of the benefits I had growing up in this town that was very Christian friendly and Bible friendly, growing up in a church that had a big music and worship program, it just meant that I was around Christianity. And I was around what I sometimes call like the worship industrial complex. Mm-hmm. Like I was around that all the time when I was in high school. And the advantages of that were getting to be mentored by some great musicians and people that had a lot of experience in leading worship, getting exposed at a young age, 13, 14, 15, to technology and sort of techniques of leading worship and all that kind of thing. But on the other hand, there was kind of a negative spiritual effect for me. And this isn't to blame anybody else. This is just in my own heart. But by the time I graduated high school, I had kind of already come full circle to a pretty cynical place about worship leading and about Christian music in general. I had led worship at a couple Christian festivals already by this time. By the time I was 17, 18 years old, I'd had a Christian rock band and done some touring around in this Christian rock band. And what I had seen from my perspective as a high schooler, what I had seen in terms of what I would sometimes call the sort of rote nature of the thing, night after night, just trying to whip up some kind of an emotional experience from a crowd or something. What I had kind of seen in the celebrity culture that surrounded some of the worship music at that time. Some of these things I'd seen, I didn't like. And I think the thing that I really didn't like is I really didn't like what was going on in my own heart as a worship leader, as a 17, 18-year-old. I really didn't like what was going on in myself. And because I didn't like what was going on in myself, I sort of projected that out onto the whole worship music scene. And so by the time I got to college to study music, I had kind of gotten out of worship leading. I loved music. I loved arranging, but I wasn't really interested in standing in front of a congregation or in front of a conference and being the worship guy. And as a matter of fact, and this kind of has to do with the path I've been on that's ended up with us starting the Porter's Gate. As a matter of fact, what I really found myself doing a lot of in my 20s, I found myself doing a lot of complaining about worship music. I don't know if you've ever been a part of these conversations or not, but you kind of get in the car after church and maybe you critique the songs or critique the worship director, or would hang out late with friends and we'd be talking about maybe how Christian music ought to be more this or ought to be more that. And one of the interesting things I began to notice in my 20s, and this was really a really important thing for God to do in my life, I began to notice that a lot of these critiques of sort of mainstream evangelical worship music, a lot of the critiques didn't really fit very well with each other. For example, I went to a Presbyterian college where I studied Reformed theology and studied hymnody, a bunch of real nerdy theology conversations. And in those nerdy theology conversations, sometimes the critique of mainstream sort of Christian radio would be, oh, it's not deep enough. That would be the critique. It would be, we need to return to the old hymns because the old hymns have a depth of theology that's missing from what's popular on Christian radio. Okay, so that's one set of critiques, But then as I started to get involved with urban ministry and working in communities that had racial reconciliation at the forefront of their ministry, well, they had a completely different critique of what was wrong with what was on Christian radio at the time. That critique was, oh, the worship music that we're hearing coming out of Nashville, or the worship music that we're hearing, on the radio or whatever, is too culturally monolithic. It's too culturally sort of white, middle class. It doesn't speak to people in other cultures, right? So that's a different critique that doesn't really have anything to do with the first critique, Mm-hmm. And then there was kind of a third critique that I would be around sometimes, which was maybe from a more charismatic standpoint of saying, no, the problem with worship music that we experience is it's not really connecting with the brokenness of the people walking in the door. We've got people walking in the door who don't know Jesus, people walking in who have real heavy hearts, who have brokenness in their lives. but the songs that we're hearing, they're not really speaking to addiction. They're not really speaking to broken families. And we need songs that are more gritty, in some ways, even different than the sort of hymnody thing, going deeper, wanting hymns that are more, that are a little bit more immediate, And what I began to notice about all these different critiques was that every one of these critiques, and this was the case for me as well, and my critiques of worship music, every one of these critiques were really speaking to worship music, critiquing worship music, because of wanting it to kind of fit into my own life in some way, right? To say, I want my worship music to be more like how I am. Like, this is the style of music I like. I want my worship music to be like that style. Or like, these are my political and social priorities. I want my worship music to reflect my political and social priorities, right? Or like, this is what my friends look like. I want my worship music to sound like, my friends look and sound like. And it was really under the,
Hallelujah, Father, let your kingdom come. Hallelujah, Father, let your kingdom come. Hallelujah, Father, let your kingdom come.
May the works of my hands bring you joy. May the works of my hands bring you joy. May the works of my hands bring you joy. May the works of my hands bring you joy. And so we sing,
Hallelujah, Father, let your kingdom come. Hallelujah, Father, let your kingdom come. Hallelujah, Father, let your kingdom come.
and it was really under the, influence and sort of tutelage of one of my mentors, a guy in Grand Rapids named John Whitley. John has a school in Grand Rapids called the Institute for the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. That I began to step back from that conversation and see worship not just as being expressive of our particular experience in the world, not just saying, I want worship to express where I'm coming from, but actually to start understanding that worship, the power of worship, is its power to actually form us into something completely different. The power of worship, not just our singing, but our prayers and everything we do together as worshipers, actually has the power to transform us, to make us not just look like something different, but actually to transform us more and more into the image of Jesus, which then kind of incidentally also brings us closer together. So that's a little bit of a longer story than I meant to say about it. But in terms of a sort of career and a spiritual trajectory, I think I spent a lot of my teens and 20s being kind of critical of worship music. And then I guess over the last 10 years have been a lot more enthusiastic about thinking about the power of worship music to actually be a way of bridging gaps, a way of building bridges, a way of actually drawing us into something deeper and not being just another way that we sort of express our cultural or theological or aesthetic.
I think it's going to be mind-blowing to some people, how powerful this all is. So before we even begin to talk about the project, because Porter's Gate is so much more than just, some songs put on a record, right? I mean,
that's right. Yeah.
Kind of describe to us, because I'm reading about it, but help those listening today to know more about the vision and the different elements in Porter's Gate.
Well, it's funny that we started talking about John Whitley, this sort of mutual mentor, I guess. One of the things that John Whitley says that I really appreciate, it really struck me the first time I heard him say it, is he makes the comment that as worship leaders, that we often act as metaphor replacement surgeons, that one of our jobs every week is we perform metaphor replacement surgery. And just to unpack that a little bit, the idea being that our people, the people walking into our churches, they are coming to church with a particular vision for their lives that they are living out of, and maybe they've gotten that vision from catalogs, from going to the mall, from the movies, from their schools, wherever it is. People have a particular image, a vision of the good life that they bring with them into worship. And that in worship, one of the things we do is we actually try to orient people to a different story for their lives, right? That we tell people, you are living out of a story of not understanding that your Father loves you. Well, here you are going to learn that your Father does love you, right? You're living out of a story that your body is ugly. But here you hear a story that God actually formed you in the womb and calls you loved and beautiful, right? Those are the kinds of things that we're doing as a worship leader.
In the garden of our Savior, no flower grows unseen. His kindness rains like water on every humble seed. No simple act of mercy escapes his watchful eye, for there is one who loves me. His hand is over mine in the kingdom of the heavens. No suffering is.
And so to kind of step back and to think about that image, to think about being metaphor replacement surgeons as worship leaders, one of the questions that has been very present here in our congregation in Charlottesville, Virginia, I know it's been a present question in many congregations around the country in the last 10 or 15 years, has been this sort of question of how the church is to understand itself in some really challenging cultural times. One of the metaphors floating around out there, one of the images that people understand the church to be, is sort of a fortress image, a fortress mentality, a way of looking at the world and looking at our neighbors. And this happens to us because of politics, because of our Facebook and Twitter feeds. There's all kinds of reasons this happens. But looking at our neighbors, looking at those who do not think the way that we do as Christians, and actually to see them primarily not as neighbors, not as people who need to know the love of Christ, but actually to start to see them as enemies. And that when that happens, we start to think of church and worship as a fortress for which we need to build walls higher and stronger to kind of keep the enemies out, right? And I think that that is one image that many of us as Christians, that many of our churches can have a tendency toward. And then on the other hand, sort of an equal and opposite response to our cultural moment for some churches has been to say, to sort of feel the embarrassment, to kind of feel the awkwardness, in conversations about human sexuality, in conversations about God's providence and his design, in conversations where having sort of orthodox, biblically Christian views makes us feel insecure around our neighbors, right? That the sort of opposite tendency then becomes to say, let's minimize our differences. Let's avoid talking about anything that's difficult. And let's basically try to look as much like our neighbors as we possibly can. And maybe we'll never get caught for being Christians. And I don't know if any of your listeners can relate to this or not, but I think that this manifests itself sometimes in whether it's things like, kinds of the sort of way that we dress or the way that we talk about movies and music and culture. There's sort of an assimilation mindset to say, I just want to blend in and I want to completely minimize these differences because the state of the church and the culture that we live in is just too painful and too awkward to try to navigate. Does that all kind of make sense?
It does to me, buddy. I think we all live that, whether we say we are or not. Absolutely.
That's right. And I think that we live that whether we're in high school, whether, I'm in my 30s. It sounds like you've been around longer than that. That I think we're all living that in different ways, even in various stages of life. And so a couple years ago, my pastor, when we were preaching a sermon, he was preaching a sermon series sort of having to do with this concept of how we think about our neighbors. And he introduced this image that was so profound and so beautiful to me that, speaking of that metaphor replacement surgery, this image as sort of a metaphor for what it is we're doing in worship began to grow in my mind and my imagination to the extent that now, a few years later, it's sort of the animating metaphor behind this project, the Porter's Gate Worship Project. And that is the metaphor of the monastery, the metaphor of the monastery. What my pastor talked about was he gave us a creative exercise to do. And he told us to imagine for a moment what it would have been like to be a wanderer, to be lost, to be a traveler, to be someone who was out on their own in the world, someone traveling from one city to another city through the wilderness, any time from about the 12th century all the way to the 17th century, to be in a place of vulnerability, to be traveling, throwing whatever you had, like as a refugee, throwing whatever it was you had, covering yourself with whatever sort of fragments of cloth or blanket that you had, and making your way through the world. That if you were in that situation, for this kind of 500-year period, whether you were in North Africa or Spain or France or Germany, that if you were traveling, if you were a refugee, if you were a sojourner, that you would have rejoiced to see on a hill somewhere a church, a monastery. And the reason you would have rejoiced when you saw it would be because you would have known that they would take you in. That these monasteries, these churches in this period of time were known above all things for their hospitality. And as a matter of fact, this isn't just a romantic image. There's actually these wonderful texts from these monasteries. In particular, the Benedictine monastic tradition has this real emphasis on hospitality. And you can still, at Amazon or at a local bookstore, you can still buy the Rule of St. Benedict, which is kind of like their sort of manual for life together. And there's this beautiful passage where they actually talk about, they designate one of the priests, one of these brothers, they designate him to sort of stand watch and look out for visitors, look out for strangers, look out for those who are lost. And that when those people came to the door, that this person's job was to welcome them as if Christ himself were among the brothers. And so this brother, was supposed to go and get the other monks and to bring them out. And they all actually, according to this manual, were supposed to bow down to the visitor, to bow before him, to wash his feet and say, now Jesus has shown his face among us in the face of this visitor, in the face of this traveler. And this brother, this person that they designated, they gave him the title of the porter. The porter was the name of this person who had the job of representing the church, representing this Christian monastery, representing it to visitors, representing it to the outside world. And one of that image to me, that image of this porter sort of standing in front of the church in the position of welcome, in the position of hospitality, that image on the one hand is so beautiful, right? That concept of a church, this kind of church community saying, welcome and hospitality is so important to us that we want it, like not just in someone's job description, but in someone's job title. Like that's what their purpose in this community is to welcome the stranger, right? That is so beautiful to me. But on the other hand, when I think about that image of this porter, this person who welcomed in the stranger, it also makes me really sad. It makes me sad for two reasons. First, because it is clear to me, and will probably be clear to many of your listeners, that people are still lost. People are still wandering. People are still grabbing up whatever it is, whatever ideas they have, wrapping them around themselves, and looking for community, looking for safety, looking for a place that will take them in. But they are not searching the horizon for the church. They are not looking for us. So that's the first reason it makes me sad. But the second reason it makes me sad is that having worked in the church now vocationally for 20 years, particularly working in evangelical churches, John, it is not clear to me that we are scanning the horizon and looking for them. It is not clear to me that when we are planning our worship services, that when we are writing our songs, when we are signing our statements, it is not clear to me that our eyes are searching the horizon and looking for the lost and looking for the wanderer and creating a space where they walk into our doors and they do not feel like an enemy or an outsider or an agitator, but for them to actually feel like we welcome them as Christ in our presence. And I understand that what I'm describing here, this sort of role of this porter, this person to welcome our neighbors in, I understand that it's very complicated because many Christians feel like we're always on the defensive. Christians feel like, whether it's in the news or on sitcoms or wherever it is, that we feel like our neighbors are our enemies. I know that happens. But I love to look back at this example, this sort of vision of these early Christians in these monastic church communities who both cultivated all these virtues. They had a very particular way of living their life together. They had very particular ideas about theology, about sexuality, about family. They had particular ways of worshiping. And yet, of all of the kinds of virtues that they wanted to cultivate, that the number one virtue that they could be known for was this virtue of hospitality. It meant that when people were in trouble, they showed up at that church's door. And so part of the challenge of this project, which we've named after this role of the porter, the Porter's Gate Worship Project, is this sort of call and challenge to say, what would it look like for us as the church in general, but as worship leaders in particular? What does it look like for us to have that kind of a posture? The posture to say, yes, we have many ideas about the world. We have ideas that are going to be contrary to some of the popular cultural motions that surround us. And yet, the thing we want to be the most known for, the virtue we want to be the most known for, the value we want to be most known for is that value, that virtue of hospitality and welcome. That I think if we were to start to ask that question of how we plan worship and how we think about our life together, I think that we would be really surprised at the kinds of people God would start bringing through our doors.
Every mother, every father called to raise a son or daughter. May your heart be patient. May your mind be clear. May our God be with you and calm your fear. Every mother, every father.
What is it that we are trying to be together? What is that animating metaphor going to be? Are we trying to build a bigger, stronger fortress? Are we trying to disappear into the crowd so that nobody asks us any really awkward questions? Or do we actually want to be a church that is known for our distinctives, but none of those distinctives more important than the way that we bend over backwards to welcome our neighbors?
Talk to us a little bit about these songs, and I believe I've got some permission to kind of weave some of these in and out of the program to give some samples.
Yes, you're welcome to use all the music that you'd like to.
Great.
That's a great observation, John, about the songs not being terribly produced and being pretty present, sonically when you listen to them. I think there's two reasons for it. I think one of them is kind of technical, and then one's a little more philosophical. I think technically, it might interest your listeners to know that the record truly is a live record. That is to say, we're set up in a room with musicians in the room and with a little makeshift 30 to 50 person congregation there in the room for most of the songs. And we just basically sing, perform, teach the songs right there in that context. And that's what you're listening to, right? So you're listening to these songs in a church sanctuary, taught and performed with people in the room, not done in a recording studio, not done with overdubs, right? And so some of that, I think, is technically probably what you're hearing. But I think there's something a little deeper going on, too. Really early on in this process, about 2 years ago, when we were starting to dream up this project, one of the first things that my wife and I both felt very strongly about was the idea that we did not want this to just be a Presbyterian worship record or an evangelical worship record or a white college educated worship record, right? But a project that actually was not only hospitable in sort of in concept, right? But also a project that was hospitable creatively, that actually invited different people's voices creatively into the project. And so with some intentionality, we invited into the writing process people coming from a Roman Catholic background, from the Vineyard, from Calvary Chapel, from the African Methodist Episcopal tradition, from the Anglican tradition, from this whole variety of backgrounds. And the idea was to say that just by virtue of people having those different kinds of church experiences, different kind of worship experiences, different theological perspectives, that we were going to have a richer record. We were going to have richer lyrics because of that. And then furthermore, when it comes to the arranging part, we recognized pretty early on that the more stripped down these songs were, because the songs are generally kind of acoustic guitar, acoustic piano, bass. That's kind of what it is. There's very, very few drums or percussion or anything else. The more stripped down that we did these songs, the more easily they would be to translate into everyone's different contexts. And so that was part of the creative decision to say we want these songs to be equally embraceable in a number of different kinds of worship contexts. And one of my favorite examples of that was on the same week, I guess the record's been out a little over a month now. And on the same week last month, there was a review of the record that came out on, or an article about the record that came out on the Gospel Coalition, which is kind of a broadly reformed evangelical, website. And then also an article about the project that came out on CatholicMom.com. And I remember thinking to myself at that time, I wonder how often that happens. Mm-hmm. I wonder how often the same project is talked about at the Gospel Coalition and CatholicMom.com. But I think that should actually be a goal of ours if we want to be that sort of a hospitable church.
In the fields of the Lord, our work is rest. He is moving in our hands and feet to bless. In the fields of the Lord, in the fields of the Lord, in the fields of the Lord, our work is rest. In the vineyards of the Lord, our work is light.
on the one hand, when it comes to songwriting and advice to songwriters in general, my two favorite quotes about songwriting are kind of the same quote. Beethoven said, "If you only set out to write masterpieces, you'll never write one." And John Lennon said that if you want to write a great song, you should just write a song every day for a year, and one of them will be great. And both of those quotes kind of hit at the same thing. That is the idea of songwriting as a craft. And like I say, this is not the super kind of biblically informed answer, but I think as a craftsmanship answer, the idea of songwriting as a craft that can only be honed by just doing it over and over again and having some kind of a discipline to it, I think is so valuable. One of the best songwriters who's working today, young guy, younger than me, his name's Wardell. You should have him on your program. Wardell is writing psalm setting after psalm setting. And part of the reason that his psalm settings are so rich is because in his job every week, he works at a church where they use the lectionary and go through the psalms week after week. So pretty much every week he writes a psalm setting, right? Now, it's not necessarily the case that every single one of those is amazing, but when he does that 52 times a year, year after year, it means that he's going to end up with some great songs. But the second piece of advice for songwriters, which I think is a little more Christian and a little bit more in the spirit of this Porter's Gate project, actually, is the idea of seeing worship songwriting really as a pastoral exercise. One of my good friends, he's a worship director at a church here in Charlottesville. He has this awesome practice that I love. I admire him for it, and I'm a little disappointed that I haven't started doing it myself. But he has this awesome practice where he's in a mid-sized church, a couple hundred people. And as both a way to work on his songwriting, but also a way to get to know his congregation better, he put out an open invitation and said to people in his congregation, "Hey, if you want me to come over to your house sometime, I'd love to come over for lunch or come spend the afternoon with you. And for you to just tell me about your life, tell me what's going on in your life, and let's write a worship song together." Now, it's not necessarily the case that every one of those songs is going to be amazing, right? But what is the case is going to be that he is going to know his people better, right? Like he's going to know his worshipers better. He's going to know what's going on in their lives better with having a practice like that. And whether it's that particular practice or whether it's, using our own imaginations to come up with our own versions of that, thinking through ways that we're connecting our pastoral work, how it is we're shepherding our people, how it is that we know our people's stories, and bringing their stories, bringing their lives and their struggles to our songwriting process. I think that it's in that moment, it's in that kind of encounter of bringing the hard thing to God and saying, I want to write something that's true and beautiful for this person. I think it is in that moment, in that encounter, where we're going to be surprised by what the Holy Spirit can do through us and through the creative gifts he's given us.
It's marvelous. Isaac, just been rich today. Thank you so much for joining us here. And tell us real quickly as we wrap up, what's the best way for people to interact? Obviously, they can get the Porter's Gate Worship Project work songs, the Porter's Gate Worship Project Volume 1 on iTunes. I'm sitting here looking at it on my screen, and they've been sampling the music throughout this broadcast, so hopefully they are running, not walking, to do that. But what are the best ways to interact with you and with the Porter's Gate?
Yeah, I think as a few next steps. Number one, if you go to the Bandcamp page or to our website, you can download all the sheet music and the chords and the lead sheets all for free. We make all that stuff available very easily. And secondly, when you're on the website, if you sign up for the mailing list, we will be over the next month or two sending out sample services and prayers and other kinds of resources, and would love to make more of those resources available for free to your listeners if they want to sign up for the mailing list. You can do that right at the website, which is theportersgate.com.
Isaac Wardell, thank you so much. God bless you for your work, and we're excited to see what's next for you. Thank you again.
Peace to you.
And also with you.
My God, wherever I go, glory. Where I reap and where I sow, glory.
Hey, thanks for listening to the show today. I'm blown away with the encouragement and inspiration that every guest brings, and today was certainly no different. If you want even more encouragement and inspiration to take your songwriting to the next level, be sure to check out NCS membership over on our site at NashvilleChristianSongwriters.com. We're all about empowering you to become the best Christian songwriter that you can be, and NCS membership is simply the fastest and easiest way to get there. Become the songwriter that you were born to be by joining NCS membership today. I'll see you next time on the Song Revolution podcast.